Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to have you on our presentation this evening, which is being given by the wonderful Nick Garbutt and the even more wonderful Alex Hyde. Sorry, Nick, you paid me to say that. Hey, look, it's great to have you guys here. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend the evening talking about rainforest photography and particularly rainforest photography workshops. Something you guys have done before on one or two occasions, of course. And I think I'm right in saying that earlier on this year, I think you were in January, I think you were in Ecuador. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Photographing some wonderful stuff. Alex, what was the best thing you photographed in Ecuador? Don't say Nick.
It was a velvet worm. No, it wasn't Nick. He was in the background of too many of the pictures, but yes, it was a velvet worm, which I'd been hoping to see for a long time.
Ah, fantastic. And Nick,
my top thing I think would probably be a Pinocchio anole, which is very small lizard that has a tiny worldwide distribution just in an area of cloud forest that we visited, and it resonated with me because it shows some remarkable sort of convergent evolution traits with one of the chameleons that I see quite a lot in Madagascar.
Amazing, wonderful stuff. And then I think you guys were in Austria together, and then if I'm not mistaken, you were both in Borneo, because I think Borneo was in September, wasn't it? And you were visiting some of my favorite places in the world: Mount Kinabalu, Kinabatangan River, Danang Valley, the amazing Danang Valley, where we held Festival of Wildlife a few years ago, which is pretty awesome.
Indeed, yeah, always a favorite, and so it was great to be back there. And Alex and I have always loved running trips there because there's just so much variety and so much to get your teeth into. It's terrific.
It's great stuff,
yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely, and you do get to build relationships with the local guides there over the years, so you do end up with this sort of community of friends there too, and that's a big side of it, because obviously they're our eyes onto the forest, so we get so excited when we meet up with them and they tell us the latest things they're going to show us, and it's wonderful fun.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, guys, without further ado, Nick, I think you're going to speak first, aren't you? And then you're going to hand over to Alex sort of midway through.
That's right.
But Nick, I'll hand over to you if that's okay. I'll come back on a bit later. For everybody on board, I'm sure you all know the story, but I shall tell you again just in case. Please feel free to post questions. There's a Q&A button on your screens, depending on what kind of device you're on. It will either be on the bottom or the top, and likewise with the chat facility. So please feel free to ask questions, and we'll go through a question and answer session at the end. So Nick, without further ado, I'm going to disappear and look forward to chatting to you later.
Thanks, Chris. Once again, good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give you an overview for the next 35 minutes or so on general aspects of rainforest and some of the rainforest trips that Alex and I do together, and why we choose to do the trips in the way that we do. There's such a lot of variety. I suppose to begin with, it's probably worth just expanding on the term rainforest in itself, because I think in general, we perhaps conjure up an image rather like this: a lowland rainforest, steamy, early in the morning, very beautiful. But that's not necessarily typical of all rainforests. This particular one is a lowland rainforest in Borneo. But as far as our rainforest tours or workshops are concerned, we are dealing with a much broader breadth of different types of rainforests that all offer different experiences, different things to see, and obviously in different parts of the world. So a lowland rainforest, whether it be in Borneo or somewhere in South America, Central America, is very different to a montane rainforest. This is a more montane rainforest. This is on the Amazon slope in Ecuador, but at much higher elevations than lowland areas. And as such, it's a very different sort of place. Obviously, there are similarities, but the sorts of animals you may encounter, the feel of the forest, the sorts of trees that dominate, etc., vary very much with altitude. And one of the things that Alex and I always try and build in where possible to our workshops is within any one workshop itinerary, you would get a cross section of different rainforest experiences. And if you go to higher elevation still, this is an upland montane forest, this time in Costa Rica. It's very different again, and the sorts of animals you might encounter and the emphasis of your photography changes once again. So don't for one moment, if you're unfamiliar with rainforests, blanket them all in the same way. They're all very, very different. And in each location that we visit, which I'll come on to shortly, the cross sections of different rainforest types that you will get to experience is quite broad. So don't think of rainforests as homogeneous. They are very, very different and all offer something very special. So as things currently stand, Alex and I have built up a little collection of destinations that we run our rainforest workshops to, those being Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Borneo, and one that we've yet to do, but will be doing in a couple of years' time. And it's a trip that's currently live and able to be booked, a new one to Belize and Panama. Now, you will obviously immediately see that there's rather a skew with that cross-section to Latin American countries, and that's simply because obviously where the world's rainforests occur, tropical rainforests we're talking about, tends to be in very, very specific places. It's not really feasible within the sorts of confines and how we run our trips to do a trip to the rainforests of Central Africa, A, because of political instability in those regions, and B, because of the types of rainforests and what live there. We can't really operate in the way that we like to be able to do these trips. So we're largely limited to Southeast Asia and to Latin America. But within that broad cross-section, there's a huge variety from which we can choose, and we're always looking at new options and possibilities or new ways of doing existing destinations. Different locations lend themselves to different attractions. One of the things that's particularly a feature in some of the New World Latin American locations is that some of the locations, the destinations, particular destinations we visit, are centered around natural phenomena that draw a species or several species in. An example, for instance, would be a clay lick. This one is in Ecuador, where scarlet macaws visit. And obviously that becomes a central attractive feature of a particular location on which all sorts of other things are then added and built around. Equally, some South American destinations, particularly Peru and Ecuador, something like a cock of the rock lek would be a particular attraction at a certain location. And obviously that becomes rather central to the photography that happens at that location, but there's all sorts of other stuff. But daily activity might be at least skewed towards making the most of opportunities at particular sites like that. One of the features, particularly in New World destinations, is the development of sites where animals are drawn in with bait or attractions or whatever it may be, effectively bird tables, because you're primarily dealing with birds here. But it's especially a feature in whether it be Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, and other Central American, South American destinations. This particular site is near Mindo in Ecuador, and a wonderful example actually of the way local people have embraced the idea of wildlife tourism and expanding natural protected areas with additional peripheral private areas in which they obviously generate business. So these are places that they've gradually over the years allowed species to become habituated and attract them in. This is a bird called a plate-billed mountain toucan, obviously spectacular, but ordinarily quite a tough bird to see because they're quite shy. And I know that the particular person who set up this location was a former guide, and he bought some land adjacent to a protected area, allowed it to revert back to forest, and gradually over an 18-month period, starting at the beginning of COVID, gradually started putting out food and attracting birds in. His aim was to get this particular species because it's such a draw. And now almost daily, these birds come down and you see them fairly easily. So it's a fantastic example of using wildlife tourism as a means of expanding a natural area and allowing visitors like ourselves to see something relatively easily that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily see or be able to photograph. Obviously, in the New World, at any location, but particularly in montane locations, hummingbird feeders often feature, and attracting hummingbirds is a huge draw. There's such diversity. Once you get to mid-montane elevations, it's often easy to see 15, 20 species in a relatively short period of time that get attracted to feeders. And obviously that then affords all sorts of photographic potential and opportunities. This again was a shot taken in Ecuador. Another draw in Peru or Ecuador at very high mountain locations is potentially the chance to see sword-billed hummingbird, which is obviously a spectacular example of hummingbirds, and one of the most spectacular birds you could ever wish to see. And there are one or two locations that we've visited in Ecuador where your chances of seeing and photographing these birds is very, very good indeed. In addition to the sorts of attraction that the location itself may offer, in one or two locations there are moth traps that are set up, or we might set our own moth traps up, something that Alex is particularly adept at doing. And obviously that then gives us a chance to come in and photograph all sorts of insects and other invertebrates that can provide a huge array of intriguing subject matter. And one of the features that we always pride ourselves on in the way that we run our workshops is that there's an awful lot of tuition and help for people who want to develop their photography and add to their skill set. Rainforests lend themselves very much to that way of working because the photography can be quite technical and involved to get the most out of it. And so working with guests, clients on a trip to develop the skills that are necessary and the techniques that are necessary is very much central to what we do. Whether that be learning to do things like focus stacking. This tailless whip scorpion is a focus stacked image that was taken on one of our recent trips. Again, this one was in Costa Rica, if memory serves me. But again, it's another technique that's very important to be using. We're very much an advocates of, what's the point in being in a rainforest unless your pictures show that you were there? There's no point in taking images that look like they could have been taken in a captive situation in a vivarium or somewhere in a captive, a butterfly house or wherever it may be back in this country. You really want your images to tell anyone looking at them that you were there, you were in the rainforest, you were experiencing that location and that habitat and engaging with it along with the subject. So it's very much about showing, where possible, subjects in the context of their environment. One of the things that rainforests always lend themselves towards, of course, is a lot of close-up work. Alex is going to delve into this more, but rainforests are fantastically exuberant places, full of life, but actually finding stuff to photograph isn't necessarily straightforward. And often smaller things can fill gaps or dominate where finding mammals and birds and so forth can be more problematic. So lots of macro photography is very much a theme within the trips that we do, not exclusively, but it certainly can occupy a good chunk of what we do, simply because those are the subjects that we can guarantee finding and allowing people to photograph in whatever way they choose. Whether it be smaller things like this is obviously leafcutter ants. These were photographed in Costa Rica using this wacky lens that Alex is demonstrating. It's called a probe lens, but it allows you to get really intimate shots like this. And also, we're very much advocates within that sort of theme of showing subjects in their environment, but so much is on offer with respect to camouflage and subjects that are exquisitely camouflaged within their environment. And again, that's something that this sort of approach really allows you to delve into. This is more of a staged image rather than the previous one was an image that, you know, as you would potentially find it in the wild. This was a silk moth that came into one of our light traps, and then we set it up on appropriate bed of leaves in order to photograph it and demonstrate a principle. But again, that sort of thing is something that this sort of approach can allow you to do. We're always also very much of a mind to try and get people on these trips to look away from something that's ordinary. We're not trying to promote just getting a record shot. This is a fairly dull picture of a heliconius butterfly. Again, this is in Ecuador. And this butterfly simply was fluttering around in the understory, landed, and I just got this grab shot. But it stayed there for a good number of seconds, and it allowed me to just think, have time to think what would make this better. And on examining the situation, all I had to do was move myself less than a meter to left or to right to alter the background, alter what the composition would look like, and then deliberately alter my exposure parameters to create an image that, to my mind, has much more interest and artistic intrinsic value. And that's this, which to me says so much more about the dark interior of a rainforest and a little pool of light with a subject and so forth. And all I did there was move my body position less than a meter and alter the exposure parameters in the camera. Nothing else, but it completely changes the feel of the picture and the story that you're telling about being inside a rainforest. Similarly, you're surrounded by foliage in a rainforest. So the idea of subjects being surrounded by seas of green is obviously a theme that can be explored. Here we've got a shield mantis. This was in Ecuador. This is a paradise tree snake in Borneo that's done in the same way, where you're deliberately looking for windows through lots of leaves to a subject that can be isolated around out of focused areas. And it's a very powerful technique to employ where possible. Another example with a snake, this time back in Ecuador, again using a window of foliage to photograph this Osborne's pit viper. I'm just going to talk a little bit more specifically about Peru and the locations that we visit in Peru. Peru will be our next actual workshop that we are running in a rainforest in September next year. And it's an absolutely fantastic place. The entire trip is centered around Manu Biosphere Reserve and several locations at different elevational levels within Manu, which is one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet, and is just stunning rainforest from high elevation all the way down to lowland Amazon elevations. So this is a more montane area of rainforest in Manu, where we specifically go because there's a renowned cock of the rock lek, which is obviously a particular draw, and you can visit this lek twice a day and are virtually guaranteed to see male cock of the rocks, gathering to display to females. Here you go, there's one displaying. And the hides have been built, so you've got an intimate view into various pathways into the forest where these birds gather. And at various times, there can be anywhere from half a dozen to 15 or more birds all gathering, squabbling, chatting, talking, displaying to any females that may gather as well. Utterly spectacular. But in addition, forests like this are fantastic for invertebrates. This is obviously a moss mimic bush cricket, and primates as well. Lodges are always good places to attract primates. We've got capuchin monkeys, which offer plenty of opportunities. And then once you drop down into lowland elevations in Manu, all sorts of other things become possible. This is another location where hides have been built, but this time at a macaw clay lick for red and green macaws, not scarlet macaws, red and greens. And they gather on most days at this wonderful clay lick, and obviously offer fantastically colourful photographic opportunities. Other primates too. This is a squirrel monkey, and again around several of the lodges in the lowland areas. These are the sorts of things that you have a good chance of encountering and photographing. One of the sites that we visit in Manu is at a place called Crees, which is a combination of an eco-tourist site and a research site. It's one of those places that's really uplifting once you know its full story, because less than 50 years ago, it was nothing more than a banana plantation. So it's not in the core area, it's in the buffer area. And it was taken over by a conservation group and research organization who've effectively allowed it to revert back to native forest. And it now supports something like 95% of the biodiversity of an untouched primary forest, and is the site of an awful lot of ongoing research into all sorts of aspects of rainforest biology and ecology. And one of the beauties of staying there is that you can tap into that knowledge base of whatever research is taking place at that particular time, the researchers that are there, the subject matter that they're studying. When Alex and I last visited, there were people studying some of the poison dart frogs. So we obviously had opportunities to not only see, but photograph some of the poison dart frogs that these researchers were engaged with. And it also means you have a chance of seeing species that you may never normally see. This is an Amazon horned frog, which, as you can see from its sensational camouflage, would be incredibly difficult to find ordinarily. But when you've got research people out in the forest who are experts, then your chances of seeing things like this increase no end. So Crees is a wonderful place to gain an insight into rainforest ecology, but also give you an additional window into seeing species that you might struggle to find elsewhere. It also affords you plenty of opportunity to go out at night, very much a feature of all our rainforest trips. Night walks allow you to see and photograph all manner of things that obviously are intriguing, engaging, and you will not see during the day. And there's lots of photographic challenges with photographing at night, obviously. Alex is going to obviously delve into that a little more, but using flash is one of the obvious things that you have to get a grip with. So this again is in Peru, one of the leaf mimic katydids, and this was a shot taken using a couple of flash guns and using flash to backlight the insect, so you get that lovely luminosity within the subject. Similarly, this is a waxy monkey frog, utterly spectacular species, but this again was a more involved shot that we spent some time doing after dark, because this actually involved using 3 different flash guns to not only illuminate the frog, but also illuminate some of the background, so you can see that it's actually a frog within its rainforest home. It's not just a frog surrounded by a black background. A new trip that we have in place, but have yet to actually run, will be in 2026 to Belize and Panama. Now, we're running this in conjunction with a mate of mine, Lucas Bustamante, who's Ecuadorian. Some of you, I'm sure, have come across Lucas, who's a fantastic photographer and a real tour de force when it comes to rainforest conservation and so forth. And we run our Ecuador trips in conjunction with Lucas, but he's been running trips to Belize and Panama for 1 or 2 years now. And so we're going to be working in conjunction with Lucas, obviously tapping into his expertise and knowledge when it comes to the itinerary that we're following. And all being well, Lucas will be involved in that trip as well. So we know we're in for a treat. Some familiar species, some very different species. This is actually one of Lucas's photos of an ocellated turkey, a bird I've never seen, but state the obvious, an utterly spectacular bird that we have a very good chance of seeing on the Belize portion of this particular tour. Plenty of other species we're likely to see are ones that you may have encountered if you've done a trip to Costa Rica, things like keel-billed toucan, manakins, as well are very much a feature in Belize and Panama. This shot was taken in Costa Rica, but the same species are visible and likely to be seen and potentially photographed on the Belize and Panama trip. As are some of the primates, Central American spider monkey, and coatis, all species that are found quite widely in Central America. So whether you see them in Costa Rica, Belize, Panama, or whatever, doesn't really matter. But obviously the opportunities to photograph them vary depending on the location. Certainly reptiles and snakes will hopefully feature. I have a very soft spot for snakes. So when there's a chance to photograph them in rainforest environments and locations, I jump at the opportunity. This is an eyelash pit viper, which is a stunning snake that occurs in various color forms. And again, in Belize and Panama, there's a very good chance of us finding these particular snakes in 1 or 2 of the locations. And hognose pit viper as well. This was actually photographed in Costa Rica, but I know it's a species that we at least have a chance of encountering on the Belize and Panama trip. As of course are red-eyed tree frogs, iconic species of Central America. And one of the main draws for the Belize and Panama trip is a wonderful diversity of poison dart frogs. This is the classic blue jeans poison dart frog, but also rather remarkably considered the same species, but on 1 or 2 islands off the coast of Panama, this, believe it or not, is the same species of frog, but just a color variation, as is this, which is quite stunning. And we will be visiting a cross-section of these islands where we have a chance of seeing several of these color variants, which is obviously particularly exciting. So that's for the future. I'm just going to go back now to one of our established locations. As Chris mentioned, Alex and I most recently were in Borneo in September. Will always be one of our favorite locations, and obviously very different to Central and South American rainforests because of the cross-section of species that you see. And great variety of forest type because there's such a broad elevational range, particularly in Sabah, which stretches from the upper slopes of Mount Kinabalu and very high mountain forest, which offer a chance to see all sorts of things that are locally endemic. One of the things, of course, that the area is renowned for are rafflesias. No guarantee of seeing these, and often when you do see them, they're in not cultivated plots, but plots where they're at least managed. So they don't necessarily look like they're in completely wild forest because they're very valuable. And it's big business having these plots and charging people to come in and see them when they're in bloom, because they only bloom like this for 2, 3, 4 days. So it's big business for people who own these plots and manage them for the benefit of the rafflesia, but spectacular things to see, obviously. Great invertebrates in these upland forests. This is a trilobite beetle, which actually breeds when it's a larva. It never attains a full adult stage, which is quite remarkable, and plenty of frogs too. So lots of variety in upland forests, and then you can wend your way down to lower elevations. The Kinabatangan River is one of the most famous locations in Borneo, perhaps more renowned for its larger species, monkeys, proboscis monkeys in particular, and Bornean forest elephants. If any of you have been watching the Asia series that's been on screens recently, obviously there were features on Bornean pygmy elephants in that series, I think it was the Tangled Forest, Rainforest episode, and how they're interacting with and utilizing palm oil plantations and altering their behavior so they're able to survive in areas that aren't totally native forest. And indeed, some of the palm oil plantations are embracing elephant presence and able to utilize the fact that the elephants are able to eat and digest a lot of the felled old palm oil trees, and they're actually providing a service. So it's quite a nice example of where things have sort of come full circle, and wildlife is actually being used and is benefiting a commercial operation. We also, on our recent trip, spent quite a lot of time visiting Gamantong caves, which wouldn't necessarily be everyone's cup of tea, because inside the cave it's challenging conditions, to say the least. Lack of light, for one. Very smelly. This is a cave full of cave swiftlets, millions of bats, and therefore lots of guano. And as a consequence, lots of creepy crawlies and invertebrates that aren't necessarily the most palatable things. Cockroaches galore. But also some really interesting things like long-legged centipedes. So offers plenty of photographic opportunity. I know Alex is going to talk more about this, so I won't dwell, but I mentioned millions of bats, and it's one of the particular features of Gamantong. But one of the things that was new for this year, something that was built during the COVID lockdown, was access to some of the upper entrances to these caves. You can see this is an entrance from photograph from within the cave. But these are the holes through which the bats leave the cave at dusk to then go out and spend the night foraging. And so platforms have now been built at the entrance to these caves up on top. So you have to climb something like 700 steps to get up onto these platforms to give you a vantage out over the forest, and where the exit and entrance holes to these caves are situated to actually watch thousands, if not millions, of bats emerging at dusk. And it offers all sorts of photographic opportunities. Alex and I, having never seen it before, concentrated our efforts for actually photographing the bats, but we slightly missed a trick, because one of the main visual events and events to try and photograph are some of the predators that come in to actually take the bats as they emerge, and those include birds of prey and hornbills. And a couple of our clients who concentrated their efforts on that got some amazing shots of hornbills in particular taking bats in midair. And if you haven't already seen and looked through the successful entries in this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, you will notice, if you look through that, there's a shot of hornbills taking bats at Gamantong Caves in that as well. So this was a very special photographic opportunity, and one that I know I can't wait to go back and have a chance to revisit. And I'm just going to finish off by talking a little bit about lowland forests in Borneo, one of my favorite locations, Danam Valley, where, again, invertebrate photography can be sensational, because the cross-section of invertebrates that you can see potentially there is huge. This is a flower mimic mantis and a lanternfly, that was photographed on our recent trip. And more spectacular still, this is a three-horned rhinoceros atlas beetle, one of my favorite species. So I hope that's given you a fairly broad cross-section of some of the things that we're likely to see. Danum in particular is one of the best places to see primates. This is red leaf monkey, and of course, if you get lucky, orangutan. Good bird life too. This is an Argus pheasant, and one of the things that's starting to happen more and more now in Borneo, which they've been a little slow on the uptake with, is the development of hides and bait stations to attract birds into, which has obviously been a feature of many of the Latin American destinations that we visit, but has yet to really become a feature of rainforest destinations in Borneo. But that's beginning to change. So I know in Danum Valley, for instance, they're in the process of constructing some bird hides where the intention is to start attracting some of the more difficult to see species in so they can be seen more readily. And there are now other locations in Borneo where that already is up and running. So things are gradually changing. And again, I'm just going back to the Asia series. I don't know if any of you have watched, if you have watched the entire series, the final program has a little snippet about a lovely conservation project in Java, where someone is turning around an ingrained destructive tradition of capturing songbirds and keeping them in cages, and where there's songbird competitions and things. And they're now encouraging people to go and listen to those birds sing in the wild, attracting them into areas, building hides, and then encouraging them to photograph them. So instead of there being songbird competitions, now there are bird photography competitions, which is obviously fantastic because you've got an economic justification for forests and wildlife being kept in situ and people earning a living from it. So this sort of idea is being expanded upon. Danum's a wonderful place for invertebrates, vertebrates, great for frogs. This is one of my favorite frogs, Bornean horned frog. Wonderful camouflage example again. And from our most recent trip, we were lucky enough to see groups of mating Wallace's flying frogs. Again, not a species you could always expect to see, but terrific if you're lucky enough to see them on a particular visit. This is a crested forest dragon, again, going back to the idea of making sure you show your subject in the context of its environment. And I'll finish off with a snake picture just because obviously it's a favorite of mine. Again, in the forest, and this is a shot, it's not a particularly special picture, but it's one that I particularly like because it so clearly shows this keeled pit viper within its forest environment, which is something that's so central to the approach that Alex and I adopt. I'm going to finish there. I think that's my last slide. So allow myself to hand back to Alex. And I know he's going to talk more about one of the other ideas that we're developing for our future tours in Borneo. So I'm just going to hand it back to Alex now, okay?
Okay, thank you, Nick. Don't think I'd seen all of those images before, actually. It was fantastic to sit back and enjoy, see what you've been up to. I mean, often when we're on trips together, Nick and I are sort of exchanging notes, sometimes working side by side, sometimes in other bits of forest. But it's amazing how a different photographer always has different eyes on a scene. Okay, let's get this up and running then. Right. So you take all this equipment to the rainforest, and it's easy to feel a sense of trepidation. They're not always the most physically pleasant places to be. Can be hot, steamy, various insects trying to eat you. But it's a very exciting place. The trouble is, you start walking around, and you start to wonder where all of the wildlife is, because actually most of the creatures there are trying very hard not to be seen because they don't want to be eaten, which makes sense. Um, we have to sort of get this across to the guests with us as well. It's not quite like the old Attenborough documentaries, at any rate, where everything's swarming with life all the time. And it's not that the creatures aren't there, you've just got to learn a few tricks about how to spot them. So I tend to sit down and just take in the scenery for a bit and listen and talk to my guides, and also use the fact that we're in a group, so we've got lots of pairs of eyes on the forest. The secrets start to reveal themselves if you give them time. This is the nictitating membrane of a tree frog's eye. So it's like a special auxiliary membrane that allows it to peep through at the surrounding environment without maybe giving away the overall form of its eye, all part of it staying nice and camouflaged. A lot of the views you get of primates will be long lens work, which I think is appropriate anyway. I wouldn't want to get too close to these. And you're sniping through little gaps in the forest. You're using that foliage to maybe frame the shot. This is the Pinocchio anole that Nick mentioned in the first half, and we were so thrilled to see this. Really is a spectacular creature. But obviously, this is the sort of thing you could go charging past if you walked at a normal pace. Here we've got a moss mimicking stick insect. Now, without the benefit of a laser pointer, it's very hard to show you where this stick insect starts and the moss stops. But if I go to the next shot, you'll at least see what its head looks like. And the little turrets coming off its head there are perfect examples of what these highly cryptic insects do, which is effectively mimic the landscape around them. They're almost like little abstract paintings of the rainforest, each body, in this case, covered in these little false moss-like projections. We find an awful lot of subjects by simply turning leaves over. So the underside of this leaf has revealed this wonderful caterpillar covered in these plumes. And you often have to take a second look to really see a subject. So there's a really lovely lichen here. Now, I'm very fond of lichens. I know a few of you out there will be too, but perhaps not everybody's cup of tea. However, if you look to the right of this, there's a curious sort of conical shape, also dressed with red and white. This is the case of a bagworm. A bagworm is a caterpillar from a moth. And if you know about caddisflies, it's a similar principle. Caddisfly larvae construct little protective tubes out of aquatic vegetation and pebbles. The bagworms will chew up the environment that they're on, be it lichens in this case, and tree bark, and form a protective cylinder that they hide within. And at the top of that, it will be munching away at the tree underneath. I've seen some earlier this year in Borneo that were on some blue plastic rope that was along the edge of a boardwalk, and they'd chewed that up and built their little containers out of blue plastic, so they're not fussy. This thorn insect is obviously imitating the thorny bushes that you very often find in rainforests. You have to be a bit more careful about where you put your hand very often. And we were delighted to discover this thorn mimicking spider this year in Borneo. So it rests by day in this configuration and comes out every night to spin a new web. But you can see it here walking around. Quite extraordinary. But as Nick mentioned in the first half, very often you're looking for smaller creatures in rainforests. You simply stand a much better chance of getting some nice photos that way. You can get up close to them, and I certainly find it's a life's work to even try and skim the surface of the diversity that's out there. Well, this is my best ocelot photo so far. Maybe one day I'll get something a bit more convincing. But I always remind people to take these sort of pictures. It's not all about going for glory. It's not about filling the frame with a headshot all the time. Let's get a sense of the journey you've been on, a sense of that very special environment. If ever you see ripe fruit on the ground that's been nibbled, it's a very good sign. You're using your field craft there to track down who might have been nibbling at that. And this was actually my first ever encounter with an orangutan in Borneo. And the floor was littered with these figs, and it was so wonderful to just find a few little vistas through the foliage to frame up on this orangutan. Of course, whilst there are many insects and amphibians, reptiles who are trying to hide the whole time, there are some that openly advertise their presence. This is a form of aposematism in which creatures display bright colours to show that they're toxic. You don't want to eat me because I'm full of poisons. Certainly makes for a nice photo though, so it doesn't work on macro photographers. It attracts macro photographers, I find. And these colours were hard to believe. This is a juvenile predatory katydid. The same goes for the poison frogs, of course. Their skin is full of alkaloid toxins and all sorts of potent compounds. To get this photo, I crept up on the frog over about 5 minutes. Poison frogs are really fun to work with. They come out during the day. Almost all other frogs seem to come out at night, so you actually have some daylight to work with. These are so tiny, though. They're about the size of your thumbnail, and they are generally quite skittish. So if you go charging towards them, they'll just disappear. However, if you just approach very, very slowly through the leaf litter, they'll sit quite still. This is a 3-second exposure. And to get a shot like this, I've used a very small tripod to support my camera. So 3 seconds because there's very little light down there. It's very dingy under the leaf litter, but with a tripod, that does not matter. You just set it to the exposure time you need to capture the light you need, and off you go. You do your homework during the day in the forest because actually the night time generally gives you more productive photography. Every night we get out on a night walk when we're in the forest. And I knew that this tree hole was likely to harbour all sorts of interesting creatures. You can see this tarantula is cohabiting with all of its babies. This is actually about 4 meters up a tree trunk in Borneo. And whilst it was impossible to get particularly flattering lighting at that range, I did my best with a 400mm lens, a flash on top. Wonderful to see the brood care there. You might assume that the tarantulas would cannibalize one another, but not a bit of it, certainly at this stage of their life cycle. I have to be careful not to include too many spiders in our talks. I mean, I'm very fond of them and I've got absolutely zero revulsion reaction to them. I know Nick is much the same, but of course, if we just did spiders, we may see a slight slump in inquiries. So I promise you that there will be other invertebrates and creatures in here. Now here's a very bland shot of some rather ordinary looking mushrooms. It's just a phone shot I took in Borneo just a few weeks ago when we were there. But I was so excited to see it. And this is once again doing your homework during the daytime. These mushrooms are bioluminescent. So at night they glow with an eerie green light. It's actually quite a strong light. And I'd wanted to see them all my life. So I returned to this little patch. And the reason you can see some background here is because I've painted a bit of light into the background with my head torch. This is a 30-second exposure to capture this scene. So we were really blessed to find a few clumps of these on this particular visit. This is another shot of fungus. These are spores emanating from a bracket fungus, and to show up the spores, we've simply put a head torch underneath the bracket fungus and look straight down on it. So we like to photograph the whole ecosystem, Obviously, the birds, the mammals, everybody's got their place. But we like to come away with a broad sense of the whole trophic cascade, right down to the nutrients returning to the forest floor. There's so many interesting stories to be told there. There's obviously never been such an exciting time to be a wildlife photographer. The arsenal of equipment we've all got at our disposal these days is just mind-blowing, and I'm always rather humbled by it, really. I mean, you'll remember that opening slide I showed of my kit bag bursting with lenses, which I do tend to use the full range of. And I always imagine what Darwin would have thought if he saw our camera bags these days. If you think what he had to work with to record new species he was documenting back in the day, and you're talking about line drawings produced whilst looking down a microscope that might have taken several days per specimen. And we've got the privilege of just marching about, worrying about how many megapixels we've got on our latest camera. So, as I said, there's never been a better time to record the natural world, and that's what we do. I particularly like this shot of a sleeping equatorial anole. It's so peaceful, and it brings me onto a very important ethical point in that we don't want to go chasing things around, disturbing them. We want to minimize our impact. And whilst we understand we're eco-tourists, we're here to see and enjoy the creatures there, there has to be mutual respect. So we always put the welfare of our subjects first when we're doing these things. And it's particularly important to manage in a group situation. So there are so many times when we have to frustrate people in the group, and maybe only two or three people will get to work with a particular subject before we feel it's time to move on, and we don't want to pester it. It's it's one of those things that always resolves though, because whilst the rainforest can be difficult to spot creatures in, there's no shortage of them. And once you get your eye in, it turns out there's plenty to go around. One little tip I have for working with amphibians and reptiles at night with flash, which is what I did here, is to use a very low flash power. You put your ISO up very high, maybe ISO 3200. That allows your flash to be very, very weak. And in this case, it's so weak that the anole hasn't even woken up. This was an incredibly special night we had on the Kinabatangan River in Borneo. We pulled up on the muddy banks of the Kinabatangan River. It really was late into the night. We'd been out for a little look with the torches to see if we could see any eyes shining back at us, and the guides brought us to a real treat, which was fireflies roosting up in the branches of a particular species of tree. If you can make out on the left there, there's one tree full of fireflies, whilst none of the others have them in. And we sat there. Um, I think there were six of us in my dugout canoe, just completely silent for at least half an hour, just taking in the moment. Of course, initially you take photos, but then it was just about being there and appreciating it. The cloud eventually cleared, and we realized there was an opportunity to capture the Milky Way in the sky above these fireflies. So you can see right at the bottom in the middle is that tree with the fireflies in, perfectly echoed by the night sky, the clarity of which is something I've never seen at home. There's just too much light pollution where we are. We then started experimenting a bit. So it's good fun on one of our so-called photo workshops because it does create this energy amongst the guests where we all want to test out our latest ideas, and we all encourage one another to have a go. So what we were doing here was setting the cameras up on a tripod, rotating them over 30 seconds, looking at the fireflies, and on top of that, defocusing the lens. So the reason some of the circles you see there are larger is because they're more out of focus. Obviously, it's a sort of like the intro screen for a Doctor Who program, um, but strangely representative of what it felt like there. It was very magical. You did see light skipping and dancing around. So a very interesting way to interpret the scene. This is Kenneth. I don't know if Kenneth is watching this evening, but if you are, hello and good evening to you. This was in Ecuador earlier in the year, and Kenneth is using a small softbox on his flash to create soft diffuse light on this katydid. It's a technique we often use in the field just to, in this case, mix a bit of flashlight with the foreground whilst retaining the ambient light on the background. It gives a result something like this. So it just puts a bit of emphasis on the foreground. Cameras are such these days that you can easily work at ISO 3200. I think in Borneo just now, I was often using ISO 8000, which should have been a heinous crime a few years ago, but you can get away with it these days. It's clean enough to work with. So you are able to hand hold, capture a bit of environment in there where you need to. Now have a look at this. This is one of my long familiar subjects, a jumping spider. They're visual hunters. You can see very big eyes in proportion to their bodies. They jump onto the backs of their prey, ambushing them. They don't actually spin webs for catching prey as such. Now, I'd say about 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 10 plant leaves in the rainforest seems to have a resident jumping spider somewhere watching it maybe. It might be in a little silken retreat underneath. It might be beautifully camouflaged itself. So it's no surprise that some other invertebrates have cottoned onto this and mimic the jumping spiders. In doing so, they reduce the chance of being predated. So a jumping spider will not want to confront another jumping spider for fear of a fight. This little moth, it's a metal mark moth from Borneo, may not look like a jumping spider to us initially, but if you squint at it, you'll see it's got a row of eyes with catch lights in along the top of its wings, 6 eyes there looking back at you. And almost more remarkable, when you really squint, look at those wings at the side. There's dark stripes to them that appear like the legs of a jumping spider on either side. It's just enough to scare off any jumping spiders that might be there that would have pounced on it otherwise. I think the most amazing thing was that this moth jumped around rather than walked, so it actually moved like a jumping spider too. Apparently, jumping spiders will see this and do a threat display back, and this will alert the moth so it can make good its escape. I'd never seen this before, and it was just a grab shot before it was all over. But I was so pleased to witness it. We'll spend time looking for details within the landscape. You know, it's a messy composition, isn't it? I always joke that our aim is to annoy camera club judges with the chaos in our rainforest pictures. Well, at any rate, you don't want to set everything up all the time. I think it's better to capture a bit of honesty in your picture. And this snake had sloughed off its skin by entwining itself in the roots and the leaves to slough it off. So that's just where we found it. And you can see the lens covers of its eyes there. This is a very close-up image of a hummingbird's feather. It's got a real electric energy to it. Tiny little scene. I mean, this must have been about half a centimetre across, perhaps. Who knows what consumed this moth, but you see a surprising number of moth wings scattered about the forest. Damselfly wing, just as it was found. And this gives you opportunities. These little treasures you find whilst walking through the forest make excellent field studio topics. So you can scoop them up, pop them down, and try lighting them maybe in creative ways. So we're shooting a flash through that cone of paper we've got there. This is a very high-powered macro lens, the Canon MPE 65. It goes up to 5 times life size. Nick uses a Lauer lens that's equivalent magnification. And it's a lovely chance to get the guests around and show people some really exciting techniques. You know, how do you light something maybe that's the size of a grain of rice, get it to fill the frame, get it to really sing. So here's that damselfly wing. And these are the most remarkable structures. These are scales on the wing of a predated silk moth. So we found Just a tattered wing of a silk moth lying on the ground. Who knows what ate it? It looked a right mess actually, but when you went in close, the chaos of the disturbed scales, particularly those plumose ones at the top, was really quite beautiful. We spent a long time working with that. And those are two views from the same wing, just showing the variation you can get within one tiny specimen. Of course, once you've tried your hand at static subjects at that magnification, it gives you the confidence to maybe try it on living subjects, as long as they're staying still. This is here to show you one of the commonest types of flash diffuser we see on the trips these days. Nick and I both have something like this ourselves. This is Louise with her homemade one that served her very well. It's like a sort of cone that takes the light from the flash, which is on top of the camera, down to a much wider diffuser at the end, channeling the light but softening it as well. So it falls over the subject to create really nice soft light. Allows you to operate hands-free as well from the flash, so both hands on the camera. And you can go around all night long getting this lovely soft light on your critters. Because on an average night walk, you might see about 100 things to photograph. And so you need a fairly robust and easy system, I think, for that. Here's the velvet worm I was talking about at the very beginning. Doesn't look like much, does it, actually? It looks like a funny brown worm, but they're very basal invertebrates, somewhere between the arthropods and the annelid worms on the evolutionary tree, quite closely related to tardigrades, if you know what those are, the water bears. So they're one that pops up in the textbook very often, and I was very keen to see one of these. But once again, lit with that simple diffuser we just saw. We do try some more ambitious flash pictures. I think it was maybe all but one of the group managed to get a picture of these bats nectaring at this flower in Costa Rica. We set up everybody's cameras on tripods, and they were doing maybe 5-second exposures at a time whilst we fired some flashes to hopefully freeze the bats in flight. And that's what flash does. It will freeze the subject, so you don't get any camera movement, any subject movement, and it's a really powerful technique. And sometimes, of course, you want movement in the shot. So this picture of puddling butterflies in Peru was done at a deliberately slow shutter speed. But nothing can beat just taking your time in the forest, walking at dead slow pace and looking. This is a sweat bee nest. This is the entrance to the nest. Really fine filigree of, I suppose, chewed up wood pulp that they've assembled here, coming out of the side of a buttress root. A mother centipede showing excellent brood care for her young, just as a centipede might do in a garden in England, like I might see in the back garden tomorrow. They behave just the same. The fact that this one's about 5 times bigger doesn't make any difference. Understanding flash is one of those critical skills if you're going to be a successful wildlife photographer. Nick and I do spend a lot of time with people one-to-one on these trips where they need it, get you up to speed with the system you've got. But certainly I have loved insects passionately since I was a little boy, and it's just such a privilege to be able to use the technology to get these lovely detailed images of them these days. And we're so desperate to share these techniques with everybody who comes along. You can see here a rather dingy and disappointing view of a poison frog nestled down in the leaf litter. And what we've done here is use a tickle, just a tickle, of fill-in flash. So we don't want to overwhelm the light in the background, but it was very near the end of the day. I expect it would have been about a 10-second exposure to get this amount of light on the frog. So even with a tripod, it wasn't practical. So a little bit of flash went a long way there. Other lighting forms we use, ultraviolet light at night. Various different invertebrates fluoresce under ultraviolet. This is a harvestman. Really interesting to see. Obviously, more classically, people look for scorpions, don't they? But there are millipedes, even slugs and caterpillars that will fluoresce. Some insects bring their own illumination. This is a click beetle, really quite a big one, maybe an inch and a half long. You can see it lighting up the leaf skeleton either side of it, and here it is running around underneath a leaf skeleton. This is a 30-second exposure with a tripod. Little bit about lens choice now. So Nick touched on the probe lens that we're both very fond of. This is not a probe shot. This is what you might call a record shot. It's lovely, you know, it's all crisp in focus, f/16 on a tripod, but it does make me yawn a bit. So this is a much more interesting bug's eye perspective. We've got the probe right in next to them, a bit of environment as well. This is the setup. You can see there's a wacky long-armed flash coming off the top of the camera too, which helps get the light in where it's needed at the end. The probe was also very useful in Borneo earlier this year with the giant cave centipedes in Gamantong Cave. You can see here, it just lets you approach these otherwise skittish creatures without any trouble. The probe lens is very good for poison frogs too, you know, just poking it through the leaf litter carefully. Gives you these wonderful views. And there's no way I could have got this close with a conventional lens because this is actually delicately placed right next to the antenna of this centipede without touching it. So nothing else could have actually fitted into that space. Same sort of idea. This earthworm from earlier in the year was just outrageous. It was 75 centimeters long. And I think if you'd said to people in advance, you know, one of the itinerary highlights will be an earthworm, they'd have laughed. And yeah, once again, we'd have probably seen a slump in interest. But I kid you not, everybody was amazed by this thing. And here you go, the all-important context shot for scale. So I think it's this sort of childlike fascination with the natural world that should drive your photography. You know, you're using your camera equipment to learn as much as you can about the natural world, and it's such a privilege to do so. Here's another subject that I saw for the first time this year in Ecuador. It's a mirror spider. They imitate water droplets. So beautiful, so delicate. When they move, the silver effect dissipates, and you can see those little islands of silver spread out. It's guanine under the exoskeleton, but it soon reassembles. So a spider that imitates a water droplet, playing around with particular angles of light, looking up at these spiders here. The refraction in the silk producing this beautiful effect. And, you know, for some people, this might be something they're interested in. So it's an exercise we often look at, you know, what angle do you need to get this relative to the sun? Of course, there's so many biological stories to tell in the forest. I don't know if anybody saw the series on, I don't know if it was Netflix or Prime or something, called The Last of Us, about a cordyceps fungus that overthrew the human race. Well, whilst that was fantasy, it's very real for a lot of spiders and insects inside the rainforest. So we often look for these eruptions of fungus from long deceased invertebrates. This is a jumping spider here. This is a cricket, all overcome with fungus. You get your eye in for these eventually. You sort of learn where to look for them, and they do glow the nice white light. Here's another of the moth traps we ran. You can see a mantis has come in there. And the trouble with them is they're so interesting that it's very hard to do anything the next morning other than stare at beautiful moths, which is a nice problem to have. Gives a lovely chance to photograph species you might not otherwise see. And if you're into Photoshop, it's quite fun doing these little montages with them against the white background that they land on. So we do plenty of stuff with laptops in the evening. You know, you might grab a beer and a laptop and share some ideas together. Here's Lucas actually lending a hand. So that worked out particularly well for Nick and me. There's a lovely energy once again as people review their work and talk about ideas. This is about as boring as we get on trips. I'm sure Nick will agree. This is a white balance card. Oh my goodness, it's like a photography textbook. But if you photograph a neutral grey card at the beginning of the day, you can take a white balance off that, and you can see this image of a moth is at the wrong white balance. But by applying the white balance from the grey card, you can see it's corrected here. So sort of before, a bit too warm, after the greens really come across properly. So we come in at all levels really with these sort of ideas, concepts. Maybe you've never looked at white balance before, maybe you're very experienced with it. It doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to finish by talking about a completely different side to things that I'm sure is important to everybody watching this evening, which is, thinking about what we can do for the natural world, possibly confronting some of those subjects we don't talk about maybe as much as we ought to, as well-traveled photographers, which is you've got to think about the carbon footprint of what you're doing. You've got to think about what you can give back to the planet and the communities you visit. So the trips Nick and I arrange always include a factored in donation to a local charitable cause, a conservation cause. And this was a particularly enriching experience when we were in Ecuador because we got to visit a community that really subscribed to the whole model of ecotourism to keep the oil prospectors off their land and develop hide systems to see macaws, trail systems to see all sorts of creatures, and it supported the whole community there. So by visiting, that was great. We supported it, but we wanted to go a bit further than that too. So this was a macaw visiting site in somebody's garden, basically, their little patch of rainforest. They had their family house there, a little further away, and you paid a fee to visit. And it was great. It supported that family. It worked out for the macaws, obviously. This is the trouble. All around that region of Ecuador, there's oil extraction going on. And once the oil's gone from that bit of forest, the forest that remains is pretty trashed. So you want to be able to do something about it. And maybe that's a small way of helping. And you have to make these choices, don't you? Do you want this going up and down the river, which we saw plenty of, or do you maybe want this model, which I've maybe simplified slightly here? But there's a canoe with a wildlife watching team aboard, much like we were, making the most of that lovely opportunity. And you realise all of the creatures you're seeing there have some level of protection by you being there and photographing them. And you have a jolly good time whilst doing it, even if it is pouring it down with rain. Of course, there's Kenneth again sporting a plastic bag, one of the most important bits of kit if you do visit a rainforest. Did I mention about the physical discomfort at the beginning? Yes, it's not for everyone. I would say you work harder per picture than almost anywhere else I can think of in a rainforest. But the rewards of spending time somewhere as special, somewhere as ancient and diverse as that, are just incredible. And it certainly keeps us going back as often as we can, something we're so passionate about. So that's the end of my bit. And I think we'll be quite happy to take some questions. Okay. And it's just a little reminder here before I finish that we've got a Bornean macro tour we're keeping under wraps for the moment. We won't be able to release that just yet, but just put it on your radar if you particularly like macro photography. Something interesting coming in Borneo in 2027 that will just be looking at that aspect of rainforest photography. Okay. And Chris, there's the hint to put out the poll as well. So
Thank you very much,
just,
Alex.
extract
And
my
of your camera bag as a reminder.
yes. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. I think that's what I do, isn't it? There.
Yeah.
Did I get it right?
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys. Gosh, that was amazing. That was really excellent. I think I've launched the poll. Can you just confirm that you guys can see it on screen?
I've got one.
Brilliant. Okay.
There's some great things here I'd like to find out about. I might click on some of these.
You're not biased by any chance.
Right.
But there are, I entirely agree. Look, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. One of the things I think is rather interesting is that you both have unbelievably different photographic styles, which I guess to some extent is one of the reasons why it works so nicely. The trips that you guys do together, other than the fact that you're obviously great mates and love the places you're visiting. But differences in photographic style, I think, is quite important, don't you, on these trips?
I'll let you come in on that, Nick. They've heard enough from me recently.
Okay. Well, of course, yes. I mean, it's one of the things that we reiterate time and again, that you can put half a dozen people with cameras in front of subject matter and compare notes at the end of the day and get such a wonderful cross section of images, styles, and perspectives. And there's no right and wrong. Some may work better than others. I certainly know from my side, one of the things I thoroughly enjoy about the way we do this is that I'll watch other people taking their images and learn from it. And that's even, it's not necessarily people that are more experienced than I am. It may be that they just see something in a way that I hadn't thought of. And I go, oh, hello, that's an interesting way and something worth exploring. So that notion that there isn't such a thing as one correct way of approaching it and lots of incorrect ways. There's just so many different ways of looking at something, approaching it, coming to appreciate that when you're taking an image, the background is every bit as important as the subject, and therefore how you interplay the subject with the background obviously has all sorts of ramifications for the end result. And it's something that Alex and I are forever trying to instill and reiterate in folks that come on these trips, that their way of interpreting and looking at things is just as valid as ours.
Yeah.
And it's just a question of how they then want to try and record that in a way that they get an image that they're happy with and they're pleased with. I think that's something that we try to stress more than anything else, that ultimately you should be taking your pictures for yourself. You're not trying to take pictures to please somebody else. They're your pictures. And if you come away with images that you're pleased with, then that's job done.
Yeah. I agree. But that's really good to hear. Alex, could I trouble you just to increase the size of that image that you've got on screen there? I'm just a little bit conscious. If people are looking on small screens, I think they probably won't be able to see.
It was my mistake. Yeah.
Oh,
Nick's done
it. Very much. That's brilliant. So a couple of interesting questions. I think one, I mean, I'm aware myself, having been lucky enough to visit a number of rainforests, but how frustrating they can be as places to take photographs. And I think you guys cover this to a greater or lesser degree in slightly different ways. And obviously we hope that by people joining these trips, by people joining you guys in the rainforest, they will come back with some cracking shots. But what is it that makes this a what is it that makes these workshops different to the other photographic trips that you lead? Perhaps Alex, you might want to jump in on that one.
Yes.
Because they are different, aren't they? It's a slightly different style.
They are different. I mean, it's partly a selfish interest. It's because that's how I like to do things. And luckily, so does Nick. So I really don't like going around just ticking off lists of things because, okay, I saw it, done, move on. I want to have a meaningful encounter with as many of the lovely subjects we find as possible. And that does mean spending time. And of course, the really good photography often takes a long time too. So Nick and I individually will both happily spend over an hour just thinking about how to take a photo before we even pick up the camera.
Yeah.
And it's all that thinking time that makes a picture good. The photo might be over in a 200th of a second, of course, but have you thought about it before then? So that's one aspect of workshops. It's, you know, that the itinerary factors in time to do good photography. The other aspect is, of course, and Nick and I are no different. Everybody's bamboozled by all of the technology these days. I mean, it's hard for us to keep up, isn't it, Nick? And we're meant to, because of course people will ask us, you know, what menu setting is it on this Olympus to do the focus stacking, Nick? And you'll see Nick freeze and he'll catch my eye and I'll say, I don't know either. And we'll work it out between us. But we always get there. And the point is, a lot of these techniques, such as focus stacking or using flash, do require some one-to-one time or working in small groups at the very least. So that's another thing that's factored in, that where you need it, we're there to, you know, keep you on the tracks and keep it working for you. We don't want to ram it down your throat because, of course, you might be fine with your photographic technique. Great. We're not going to force you to sit through a classroom experience every 5 minutes. In fact, our primary role, Nick, seems to be holding flash guns for people for hours on end, doesn't it? Until our arm falls off, whilst being incredibly patient and charming about it. Oh no, we're fine. We're quite happy. Oh my goodness. But you know, sometimes also we're just spotting things for people. We, I suppose, have been to rainforest quite a bit, and it's, as we said, hard to see things when you're first there. So particularly on the night walks, I'm charging off left, right, and centre, finding subjects for people, which is great fun.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And one of the there's two other questions that I think I'd quite like to ask. One is relating to the local guide. So it's all very well having you guys as photographers, professional photographers with the groups, but I don't know, Nick. Nick, would you like to say anything perhaps about the local guides? I mean, they are a critically important part of the whole operation, aren't they?
Well, they're utterly fundamental. These are the people who are obviously in the location day in, day out, month in, month out. Alex and I might only be at that location for a handful of days every 2 or 3 years. So, you know, we are not by any manner of means expert. We rely on the local guides wherever we may be, as they are the local experts, and we take a lot of advice from them over what's appropriate, what isn't, how we can approach things, and it's very much then becomes a team effort, because while they may be exceptionally good as guides and informants on finding what we want to see and how best to approach that, they may not be used to dealing with the nuances and aspects of photography that are required. So that's obviously where Alex and I come in. They can advise on how we might find something, where we might find it, etc., etc., and then we can take on board everything that they can offer and add in the photographic side. But local guides are utterly crucial, and we're fortunate, Alex and myself, in that on a good number of the trips that we've done, we're going back to locations that we visited once, twice, several times before, and therefore I've got to know guides over a period of time, and then they obviously get to know us, and it becomes a two-way exchange of information and so forth. So we do our utmost to engage with local guides as much as we possibly can. We rely on them. I mean, there's no getting around that. We are utterly reliant on what local guides can provide for us and offer, and their expertise is germane to everything that we do.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. And obviously the welfare of the wildlife is critical, right? I mean, that's, you know, that's what we love. That's why we do what we do, taking people to wonderful places to see amazing wildlife. Somebody did ask how it is you can photograph some of these amazing well, frogs and invertebrates and all sorts of wonderful rainforest wildlife, but without damaging their eyes. I thought it was a really good question.
Yeah, it's such an important question. It's nice to hear people asking this question
Yeah,
these
it's good,
days.
isn't
I
it?
think gone are the days of that sense of entitlement to a picture just because you've paid to be there. So I get to have the picture. End of story. The thought process starts and ends with the welfare of the creature. So I always think that the number one rule is you've got to make sure you're not going to disturb a creature so that it loses it too much energy, or at worst, it gets predated. Because
Mm.
obviously, if you dazzle something in the middle of the night and it runs off blind and gets gobbled up by something, that is not what we want to happen. So, very often, when we're working with frogs at night, as I said, we'll put the flash power down to an absolute minimum, and we put the camera ISO very high, so it's very sensitive to low light. So that really helps. I certainly wouldn't want to be shooting a frog picture on ISO 100. There's no need to.
No.
The other thing is just be sensitive to every single situation. So there might be a case where something's in a precarious position. You just don't want to get the group in there to disturb it. If something's sitting comfortably and safely, then that's okay. And remember that this applies to invertebrates as well. You know, we treat every creature with the same respect in the forest, whether it's an orangutan or a millipede, it all matters. Um, so, like I said earlier, there are times you have to say to people, sorry, that's it. There's one or two of you are going to get a picture and the situation's changed now, and that's fine. And everybody understands.
Yeah.
It does help in a rainforest, there's many more creatures to see, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose one other little modification I might add is that these days, often you don't even need to use flash because cameras are so sensitive. I've started using some continuous light rigs. They actually help out when I'm doing focus stacking too. So sort of making the most of what our technology can do to get around some of those issues.
Which, of course, is a
I
big
think,
thing. Sorry,
I
Nick.
think again, sorry, I've just to add to that,
Yeah,
I
go on,
think
Nick.
you have to judge each situation on its own merits and be case sensitive in that certain subjects are, by their very nature, more robust and will allow you to take a greater number of images and so forth, knowing you're not going to cause an issue, whereas other subjects are much more sensitive. And at that point, you, as Alex says, you have to just say, I think now's the time to stop, folks. And those of you who've missed out will be first in the queue next time round. And that's just something we have to judge at the time. But it is obviously something we are extremely mindful of.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then one thing that doesn't relate to technology at all is really going to be my final question that I'll pose to you. But Nick, may I also ask you just to put the final slide up, which has then got the list of the other talks and things we've got coming up. Thank you. But my final question is how fit do you need to be to join one of these workshops? A lot of these trips are to places where they're not necessarily, you're not walking over beautifully created paths necessarily, are you? And on completely flat land surfaces. But
good question. Difficult to answer because, of course, what's easy for one person is difficult for another.
General comment on fitness level, I guess, Nick, would be
Yes.
great.
Well, state the obvious. It does you no harm to be reasonably fit and active. Virtually all of the places that we go require access to the forest on foot. Now, how far you walk is really up to you and the location. There's a lot of these places that we find everything that we want to find, hope to find within 200 or 300 meters of the
Yeah.
lodge. And therefore, the necessity to go on some great long jungle trek is just not, doesn't exist. It might be an option, but it's not necessary. So you can pick and choose. And I suppose what we've always managed, or generally managed to do on our trips where there's been, shall we say, a discrepancy in physical capabilities amongst the group, is that you can encourage those who perhaps don't want to walk as far to concentrate their efforts closer to home, and those that want to or are able to go further afield have that option as well. And that obviously becomes is one of the things that's possible because Alex and myself are there, and we can split the group if needs be along lines of wanting to follow a different path or trail. But as a general rule, a reasonable level of physical capability obviously helps. I mean, first and foremost, because these are challenging environments to be in. If you think about rainforest in Borneo, a lowland rainforest in Borneo, it's going to be 30, 31, 32, 33 degrees, 100% humidity, and you will sweat buckets from the moment you get up until the moment you go to bed. And whoever you are, no matter who you are, that is a given. And it's tiring. Even if you don't walk more than 200 or 300 meters in a day, it's tiring because you're perspiring so much. But not all rainforests are like that. If you're at higher elevations, it's cooler and it's more pleasant, etc. But obviously with higher elevations, often come steeper slopes, and therefore there may at times be the necessity to walk up and down one or two hills. But again, it's very difficult to give you a broad brush answer because every location is different.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, but sorry, Chris. Yeah,
No,
I'd
go
add
ahead.
to that you can always phone the office and have a chat with somebody about the particular nature of a trip, and if needs be, they can liaise with Nick and with me. Obviously, that's going to be something that comes up, fairly frequently. We've heard it all before. We understand where you're coming from on it, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Just say it as it is. We have, I mean, we've certainly taken some some very fit people to some very extreme places. We've also taken some much older individuals to some very extreme places as well. I certainly remember somebody well into their 80s in Peru, and they were fine, and they kept themselves fit. There was no issue. And sometimes it's the whippersnappers who think they can manage it all, but haven't drunk enough water and all those little pitfalls that suffer. So yeah, they are challenging environments, but we usually have quite a diverse group with us, and maybe because there's two leaders and the local guides, we usually manage things, don't we, Nick?
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add to that is also most of the things we do are on foot, and therefore you have to carry your kit.
Ah, yeah.
And therefore, one of the things that we will always advise the group on is whatever activity we're setting out to do, to plan, where possible, we will give you fairly tight advice on which bits of equipment to prioritize. So you're not having to lug around heavy kit that you may not use. Now, it's utterly impossible to always get that specific down to a fine tuned level. And Alex and I invariably will always carry way more than we need for that just in case scenario. But where necessary, we are always able to give you fairly tight advice and say 90% of the photography on this particular excursion will be with this lens, one camera, one flash, and this is what you'll need, and basically leave all your other stuff behind so you're not having to carry things unnecessarily.
Guys, that is absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious of time.
Mhm.
I am just going to mention to all the wonderful people out there the two upcoming events which they can see on screen. One with our very own and very wonderful Ian Lloyd on the 20th of November, Discover Sri Lanka. And then with the rather wonderful Nick Atchison on the 26th of November, talking about Norfolk. Before we go, Alex, I'm going to tell you that my favourite photograph of the selection that you showed this evening was of the magnificent fungi that you showed, the green fungi.
Oh,
And
well, thank you.
yeah, and I just wondered if you've got any of those in the fridge at the moment. That you're planning to
Yeah.
photograph.
Do you know that we're not known for our bioluminescent fungi in the UK, but I have read up about one, and I do actually have a little project underway with it at the moment, but its bioluminescence level is much weaker, let's just say. Um, but I'm working on something. But yes, it was amazing, wasn't it, Nick? It's
Indeed.
it's it's a rather overused phrase when you're in a rainforest, but it was rather like a scene from Avatar, if I can say that, to see this glowing fungus. We just gawped at it, really.
Well, it sounds amazing. Hey, Alex, thank you so much. It's always lovely when you present for us, and Nick as well. It's great, really great having you guys on board this evening. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us. And
Thanks,
we will leave
everyone.
you to the remainder of it. Bye-bye.
Cheerio. Good night.
Cheerio.